So there are lots of butlers, and they're all over the globe. But who was the very first person to use Butler as a surname? By most accounts, that honor belongs to a man named Theobald Fitzwalter. In genealogical and historical documents, you'll sometimes see him referenced as Theobald Walter or Theobald le Butler. Theobald's ancestors were from Normandy, and they accompanied William the Conqueror into England in the year 1066. So the Butlers were actually Norman before they were English and Irish. When William became the first Norman king of England, this ancestor was granted large parcels of land for his loyalty and service to William. We know that Theobald was born in Norfolk, England, sometime around the year 1165 to Hervé Walter and his wife, Matilda de Villoges. Theobald's surname at the time of his birth was Fitzwalter, because Fitz means son of, so he was literally Theobald, son of Walter. Theobald's father owned large estates in East Anglia, specifically Norfolk and Suffolk counties, and in Lancashire. Theobald's Aunt Bertha was married to Ranulph de Glanville, the Chief Justiciar of England under King Henry II. In those days, the Chief Justiciar was roughly equivalent to a modern Prime Minister, and de Glanville, he was King Henry II's right-hand man, his most trusted advisor. It was de Glanville who raised Theobald and his brother Hubert and took them under his wing. As beneficiaries of their uncle de Glanville's influence, both Theobald and Hubert would quickly ascend to positions of prominence. Hubert grew up to follow in de Glanville's footsteps as Chief Justiciar, and he also became the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor of Great Britain. He was an influential royal advisor to Kings Henry II, Richard I, and John. Although Hubert lacked a formal education, historians consider him one of the most outstanding government ministers in English history. In April 1185, approximately 16 years after the successful Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, Theobald accompanied Prince John, who had been named Lord of Ireland by his father, King Henry II, to Waterford, Ireland. He was accompanied by almost 300 knights and lots of foot soldiers and archers. John and his entourage were greeted by many native Irish leaders that had been prepared for his arrival. Being the young and immature prince that he was, John looked at the long beards of the Irish and laughed and pulled on them. The native Irish, in turn, thought John was an ill-mannered child from whom no good could be hoped. Not exactly an auspicious start. As he trekked through Ireland over the next several months, John's contempt for the native Irish grew. He needed people in Ireland that were loyal to the crown and that he could trust to represent his interests when he went back to England later that year. His solution was to create key administrative positions. The senior and most important position was Chief Butler of Ireland. John made the position hereditary and gave it to one of his closest confidants, Theobald Fitzwalter. Over time, Theobald's descendants began to use the many variations of the Butler name, and by the 1300s, most family members used Butler consistently. So it's from the office of Chief Butler of Ireland that many of us Butlers take our surname. As Chief Butler, Theobald and his heirs were responsible for attending the kings of England at their coronation and presenting them with their ceremonial first cup of wine. You have to remember that poisoning people was a popular way of advancing your career in those days, so the person responsible for presenting you with food and drink had to be someone you really trusted. The Chief Butler job also came with some pretty good perks. In the feudal system then in place, Theobald was granted lots of land, including 3 substantial fiefs: Tullow in County Carlow, Arklow in County Wicklow, and Ascalon in County Gowran. The Gowran grant was the smallest of the 3, and it contained approximately 44,000 strategic and arable acres. Those are acres that can be plowed and used for growing crops. So Theobald was literally dirt rich. But there was an even better perk. In order to support the dignity of the office of Chief Butler, King Henry II granted Theobald the prizage of wines, which gave him and his heirs the right to a percentage of all the wine from every ship that docked at every port in Ireland. The Butlers received 2 tons of wine from every ship containing 20 or more tons, and 1 ton of wine from every ship containing less than that. So they got roughly 10% of all the wine coming into Ireland. It was this perk that really advanced the Butler family in Ireland and allowed them to acquire even more land, build and buy castles, and defend their property from enemies. In 1194, Theobald's star continued to rise, and he was appointed High Sheriff of Lancashire in northwest England, a position once held by his uncle, Ranulph de Glanville. The High Sheriff was the representative of the monarch in the county and the keeper of the Queen's peace. During this time, Theobald lived primarily in England, but he regularly traveled to Ireland. Around the year 1200, Theobald married Maud le Vavasour. As you might imagine, given his status and wealth, Theobald married well. Maud was the heiress of Robert le Vavasseur, a baron of Yorkshire, and she brought properties in Yorkshire, Islington, and Leicestershire to the marriage. Theobald and Maud would go on to have 3 children, help settle and develop several towns, including Thurles, Nina, Gowran, and Arklow. They started several abbeys, and they owned vast estates in both Ireland and England. It was the start of a family dynasty that would last for the next 600 years. Theobald II, the second Chief Butler of Ireland, was a young boy when his father died. His wardship was granted to Geoffrey de Morisco, who later became Justiciar of Ireland. As a young man, Theobald's career was closely linked to William Marshal II, who was Earl of Pembroke, Lord of Leinster, also a Justiciar of Ireland. His service to Marshal resulted in several land grants in Leinster. He also increased the family's presence through the acquisition of manors in Bray in County Wicklow, which is about 12 miles south of Dublin, and Gowran in County Kilkenny. His first marriage was to Joan de Morisco, the daughter of his former guardian, Geoffrey de Morisco. They had a son, Theobald III, before her death. In 1225, Theobald was ready to marry again, and he set his sights on a wealthy heiress named Rowena de Verdun. Apparently, Rowena wasn't very smitten with Theobald. King Henry III had to intervene and personally request that she marry his beloved Theobald le Butler. This must have been a request Rowena couldn't refuse, because they married a short time later. In the year 1230, Theobald was summoned with horses and arms to attend King Henry III during the England invasion of France. Because the Butler family fortune was due to and depended on his relationship with the crown, he dutifully answered the call. He died in Poitou, France a short time afterwards. He was about 30 years old. Before his death, Theobald and Rowena had 4 children. Because his son with his first wife was his legal heir, the 4 younger children were not able to inherit his lands. They were, however, able to inherit Rowena's lands. Because of that, they all adopted the surname of Verdun. Theobald III, the third Chief Butler of Ireland, was also very young when his father died. His wardship was granted to King Henry III's brother and one of the wealthiest men in Europe, Richard, Earl of Cornwall. Theobald spent most of his life in England and was best known for supporting King Henry III and his royalists against the barons. But his most important contribution to the Butler family came from his marriage to Marjorie de Burgh, the daughter of Richard More de Burgh, another Justiciar of Ireland. The marriage created a close alliance between the 2 families and added property in Carrick-on-Shore and the area around Clonmel to vast amounts of other properties, including manors in Ardmell and Kilmorakill. Theobald died in 1248 at the young age of 24. He was buried next to his father in Arklow, Ireland. Fortunately for the Butler dynasty, he had 4 children before his death. His oldest son, another Theobald, became the 4th Chief Butler of Ireland. After a very complicated wardship involving King Henry III and several others, Theobald IV, Chief Butler of Ireland, came into his inheritance in the year 1263. In 1264, the Fitzgeralds, also known as the Geraldines, were at war with Walter de Burgh, Earl of Ulster. Theobald sided with de Burgh, who was both his cousin and brother-in-law. The Geraldines captured Theobald, Richard de la Rochelle, a Justiciar of Ireland, and several knights and held them all as prisoner. They were released after a mediation between the 2 sides, but it was part of a Butler-Fitzgerald feud that would last for hundreds of years. Theobald would go on to fight the barons on behalf of King Henry III at Evesham in Worcestershire, England, and he frequently commuted back and forth between his estates in England and Ireland. In 1282, he acquired land in Connaught from Philip de la Rochelle, a relative of the man he had been captured with 18 years earlier. The Connaught land gave the Butlers a presence in Western Ireland. Theobald married Joan Fitzjohn, the daughter of John Fitzgeoffrey, who was a Justiciar of Ireland, and at one time, one of Theobald's childhood guardians. So Theobalds II, III, and IV all had father-in-laws that were Justiciars of Ireland. With the marriage to Joan, Theobald acquired manors in Essex, Hants, Surrey, and Buckinghamshire, so the Butler family had substantial landholdings not just in Ireland, but in England as well. Theobald and Joan had 10 children, including Theobald, the 5th Chief Butler, Edmund Butler, who was 6th Chief Butler of Ireland and Earl of Carrick, and Thomas Butler, the 1st Baron Dunboyne. Theobald, the 5th Chief Butler of Ireland, started his public career in 1290 by paying a fine that allowed him to do homage before the then Justiciar of Ireland. In the Middle Ages, homage was when a feudal tenant pledged reverence and submission to his feudal lord in exchange for whatever new position he was to assume. Following his homage, Theobald spent time in England surveying the properties he had inherited in Lancashire. He became indebted to his uncle during this time and had to forfeit one of his English manors to repay his loans. Militarily, Theobald was active in campaigns against the Irish of Wicklow. In 1296, he was summoned to Scotland by Edward I, King of England, as part of the First War of Scottish Independence. Theobald died unmarried and without an heir in his early 30s. The hereditary title Chief Butler of Ireland then passed to his younger brother, Edmund. After Edmund inherited the title Chief Butler of Ireland, he did homage to King Edward I at the siege of Calaverock in southern Scotland for all the lands that had been owned by his brother. As a reward for his service in Scotland, he was granted permission to pay down his £3,000 debt to the king, which was an enormous sum at the time, in annual installments of only £30. This was essentially loan forgiveness because it would have taken him over 100 years to pay the loan back without interest. By all accounts, Edmund was a highly accomplished man and significantly added to the family's reputation and fortunes. He was knighted by King Edward II in 1309. He was instrumental in defeating the O'Byrne and O'Toole clans in Glenmalura. He was paid a large sum for killing the leader of an Irish raiding party in the Wicklow Mountains. He became Justiciar of Ireland with a salary of £500 per year, which was a significant amount of money at the time. And he sat in the English Parliament as a baron. You can find him named in many history books as Edmund le Butler. For his distinguished services to the king against Edward Bruce in Ireland, he was granted a charter for the castle and manors of Carrick-MacGriffin and Roscrea to hold to him and his heirs. Edmund married Joan Fitzgerald, the daughter of John Fitzgerald, 1st Earl of Kildare, in 1302. They had several children, including James Butler, who succeeded him as Chief Butler, and John Butler of Clonmacnoise. In 1321, Edmund died in London before he was able to complete a long-standing public vow. He had vowed to take a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, where St. James, an apostle of Jesus, is buried. It was a popular pilgrimage at the time for prominent Anglo-Irish and Gaelic figures, but James wasn't able to go because of his involvement in various wars. The church considered the vow to go to Spain so serious that a papal mandate had to be made to absolve Edmund, his wife, and their son James from the vow the year before he died.